Let's bring in the chair of the House of Representatives Economics Committee, Daniel Mulino. Thank you for your time, Daniel Mulino. Do you think the RBA's got the right level of increase here with 25 basis points heading into Christmas?
Well, look, I think they've been flagging for a while now that there were more increases in the pipeline. And what they're really balancing at the minute, as I see it, and in terms of what they've been saying, is that inflation remains high. Inflation probably hasn't peaked. It's probably going to peak in fourth quarter of this year. So they're putting in place interest rate rises that will bring that down hopefully to around 3% by the end of next year. But they're also conscious and balancing against that the fact that there's now been 8 interest rate rises in a row. And so a number of the impacts of those interest rate rises are starting to flow through because of the lag nature of those impacts. So I think that is the kind of balancing act that underpins their reasoning.
What's your read on the concern around a potential for a wage price spiral, particularly in the context of the recent IR laws passing the House of Representatives and the Senate? Will that add any risk to that environment?
I see there as being a pretty low risk at this point. So the wage price index at the moment is 3.1 on its latest read, and that incorporates the increase in the minimum wage. That was a really important election commitment from the then opposition, now government. So 3.1, of course, remains significantly below where inflation is right at the moment. The most recent quarterly read of inflation was over 7. The latest monthly read was a bit under 7, 6.9. But there is an expectation that it will increase to high 7s or maybe even 8 in the fourth quarter of this year. So wage rises remain materially below inflation. I think that in the long run, the way that both the Treasury and Philip Lowe have explained it is that if we get back to inflation in that 2 to 3 band in a few years, his read of what's a sustainable wage increase would be inflation in that band plus productivity. So that would be probably even higher than where it is at the minute. So I don't see 3.1 wage price index and even wage price index rising above that as being problematic.
So is it something, though, that the government will need to keep an eye on, particularly in the context of those controversial IR laws that business argued against?
Well, it is true that some business interests argued against those laws. The government's argument, of course, is that those laws were firstly about job security as much as anything, and that there were a number of measures that give people better conditions at work, which are really important and overdue. And some of the measures that some business interests were most opposed to, the multi-employer bargaining arrangements, I think are going to have the biggest impact in the care economy, in feminised industries. So I think that the impact, I don't think, is going to be problematic in terms of wages creating a wage price spiral. And again, I'd go back to the fact that what we're seeing at the moment is wages increasing slightly. They're at 3.1 now, but it's materially below inflation. And all of the modelling is that wage increases are going to remain below inflation over the next couple of years. So I think there's every justification for fixing a broken bargaining system and allowing for wages to increase a bit above their current levels.
When you look at the inflationary environment, the real risk, and the Treasurer spoke about that a short time ago at that news conference, is on the energy price shock. How pivotal is it, not just to the household budget, but to the national one, that the government lands a deal with the states to keep a lid on those energy prices?
Well, you're right, it is pivotal, and energy price increases have been one of the biggest inflationary challenges over the last 6 months. And we're seeing this even more in a lot of major economies overseas. So in Europe and the UK in particular, energy price rises are an even greater inflationary threat than here. I think it's right that the government is taking care with this. Firstly, because energy markets are so complicated, I think there's a strong, strong and growing support for price caps, given the dramatic increase that we've seen and are likely to see more of. But it is true that energy markets are very complicated. So you want to make sure that when you implement whatever measure it is the government ends up implementing, that you do it in a way that is very careful and that takes into account all the various potential repercussions. And the other dimension, of course, that we're seeing play out is that there are many, many stakeholders here. So there's the federal government and state governments, both of whom have a role to play. And of course, there's also the private sector. And you want to make sure that you do this in a way that takes into account the incentives on the private sector to maintain supply.
We spoke about this earlier in one of your earlier answers about that lag effect of rate rises, and there's a whole scenario of people on fixed mortgages coming off those mortgages and going to be hit with this blunt instrument all in one go. This is obviously a challenge heading into 2023. How do you see the economy into next year, given that hit for many households around the nation?
Yeah, so you're right. There is going to be a significant number of people who come off fixed rates onto variable rates. I've talked to a whole range of people, whether it be economists who model this, whether it be the banks, people who spend their time trying to model the impact of rising interest rates on people who hold mortgages and on potential default rates. My understanding is that most people who follow this at the moment feel that people have sufficient buffers, that default rates may increase a bit next year, but the current feeling is that the economy will probably slow down next year, but that at the moment at least these risks are manageable. So certainly I think the RBA and the government would both be watching that aspect of the economy closely, but my understanding is that the risks at this stage at least should be manageable in an aggregate sense.
Daniel Mulino, Chair of the House Economics Committee, great to get your insights as always. Thanks.